Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name's Jennifer Welsh. I'm the director of the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. And this is the school's first public event on the East Coast, and we're very excited to be here tonight in Halifax for the 2025 edition of our Max Bell Lectures. This is the third year of this lecture series, and the title is Economic Ideas for a Stronger Canada. It's our marquee public lecture series. The initiative stems from a very simple, yet at the same time, complex idea that Canada needs better public policy to address the economic challenges facing our country. So the lectures focus on the rigorous analysis, balance, and solutions mindset that are needed to plan for a more prosperous future all across Canada. So these lectures are held in 3 Canadian cities every year. This year being Calgary, we had a lecture at the end of October, Halifax tonight, and later next week in Toronto. And the associated book that you will have seen as you came in is published each year by Sutherland House. We're very grateful to Ken White from Sutherland House, who has been our partner on this lecture series and book. So the McGill Max Bell Lectures are made possible by a foundational gift from the respected business leader and McGill alumnus, of course, a McGill alumnus, Thomas Kearns, who's a major figure in Canada's business community for the last 25 years as a director and chairman of many successful national and international companies, and the former president and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute. So through his gift, Tom recognized the need for more and better debate about Canadian economic policy and Canada's economic future. And so I want to thank Tom Kearns and Mary Janigan for their generosity. So tonight, to host our lecture and our conversation, I'd like to introduce Sarah Harding, the Dean of Law at Dalhousie and Weldon Professor of Law at Dalhousie. Sarah's education and career have spanned Canada, the UK, and the United States. And she immigrated to the United States in the early 1990s, but came back to Canada a few years ago. No doubt is a statistic in Tony's book. So I'd like to welcome Sarah to the stage as the host for this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's actually quite a pleasure to be here and to be part of the conversations this evening, and to engage in the discussion about this important topic, immigration. I feel like this little clicker is going to fall off, so I'm going to put it down there. I want to start with a land acknowledgement, which I'm sure you'll do at McGill as well. So for myself, as a member of the faculty at Dalhousie, it's a very important way for us to start. So Pier 21, here where we are, is situated on the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoqey, and the Beskodu-Magadi peoples. These are the original peoples of these lands, and we each carry collective obligations under the Peace and Friendship Treaties. Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights in Canada. So as a member of the Dalhousie community, I also want to, it's very traditional for us to recognize that African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched that part of Mi'kma'ki known as Nova Scotia for over 400 years. In keeping with the theme of this lecture, they were a very early and important migrant population from our neighbors to the south up here to Nova Scotia. So my job up here is twofold, and I'll keep it short and focused. So it is, number one, to introduce the theme of the lecture, and number two, to introduce our two discussants and the conversational engagement for tonight. So let me start by just introducing the theme of the lecture. So as Jennifer mentioned, there have been 3 lectures that are part of this, one in Calgary, this evening, and another one in Toronto. And what I liked about this when I heard this is that each lecture is actually different, and each one gives a chance for the audience and those engaging it to both sort of engage in these conversations and to sort of, have access to the information and ideas that are in Toni Keller's book. So the fact that there are these 3 different focuses, I think, is one of the compelling elements of this series. So what's the theme for this afternoon? The title is 5 Walls and a Door, The Secret Sauce of Canadian Immigration. And I expect it'll be rooted in chapter 6 of the book, if you've taken a look at it, entitled The Symbiotic Relationship Between Walls and Doors. So I want to frame the discussion with a quote from that chapter. It starts on page 47. In American politics, illegal and irregular immigration have become a source of bottomless amounts of paranoid partisanship, from both left and right. It has seeped into every nook and cranny of American culture and politics, feeding polarization and swallowing common ground like a sinkhole. That this has not happened in Canada was not due to some innate Canadian personality traits, really truly, I just thought it was because we were nicer, but really it flowed from, that was my little, by the way, it's not in Tony's text, but anyway, back to the quote, it flowed from facts. If Canadians were not constantly freaking out about unauthorized immigration, it was because they had not that much to freak out about. While immigration chaos is the kindest way we can describe the situation in the US, and maybe that's where we're going here with borderline chaos, Canada's immigration system until 2016 was a calmer middle way, welcoming but controlled immigration. So what's in the secret sauce? How did 5 walls and a door create a more controlled immigration system, whereas the US ended up with an immigration system, and here I'm going to quote Toni again, where the word system is often ironic. So with that, I hope that's a frame a little bit for what we will be talking about this evening, or what Toni and Ninette will be talking about. I want to introduce both of them. I'll introduce both of them at the same time, then invite Toni up to speak, and then he'll invite Ninette up, and then near the end, I will take questions and I'll come back up and moderate the questioning. So Toni Keller is a columnist with the Globe and Mail. Over a career of more than 30 years, he has been editorial writer, editorial board chair, and columnist for the Globe and Mail. Columnist for the Toronto Star, Report on Business Magazine, and Toronto Life. Managing editor of Maclean's editor of the Financial Post magazine, and a TV news anchor on BNN Bloomberg. Born and raised in Montreal, he's a graduate of Duke University and Yale Law School. He won Canada's National Newspaper Award for editorial writing in 2016. And Ninette Kelley, her career has focused on improving migration policies and responses to forced displacement. She served over 19 years with the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, including a UNHCR director in New York and the UNHCR representative in Lebanon. Kelley also served 8 years on the Canadian Immigration and Refugee Board. She is the author of multiple books, Reshaping the Mosaic, Contemporary Canadian Immigration Policy, People Forced to Flee, History, Change, and Challenge, and The Making of the Mosaic of the History of Canadian Immigration Policy. Most of those were with her co-author, Michael Trebilco. She has also published in the areas of human rights law, citizenship, refugee protection, gender-related persecution, and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. She is a lawyer by training. So with that, my introductions are done. I'm happy to welcome Toni up here, and we'll continue on with the evening. Thank you.
my clicker here for my one slide. Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all of you. Thank to all of you for being here this evening. The subtitle of my book is How Canada Got Immigration Right and Then Wrong. The second part of that story, the getting it wrong part, is what a large chunk of the book is devoted to. And these days, the polls say that people are overwhelmingly unhappy with what happened with the immigration system over the last few years. And my book is partly about the mistaken choices by the provinces, the business community, the higher education sector, and above all, Ottawa, and how these choices, these poor choices, basically damage the Canadian immigration system and support for Canadian immigration. But a good chunk of the book is about what came before all of that, the getting immigration right part of the story. And this story of failures and errors is all the more tragic because for several decades, Canada got a series of things mostly right, and the result made immigration pretty successful and politically popular. The topic of immigration was and is controversial and contentious in most other Western countries, and it creates various degrees of political friction and left-right polarization and radicalization in most other Western countries. Yet in Canada, if you took a snapshot of public opinion and attitudes to immigration in the 1990s or the early 2000s or the early 2010s, you'd find that the Canadian public saw immigration as something uncontroversial and even boring. They were not worried about immigration, and they were barely thinking about it at all. As for the major political parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, they were not fighting over immigration or campaigning against one another on the topic of immigration. They didn't really disagree about immigration policy. Other countries had various degrees of conflict over immigration, but we had this boring consensus. And that was quite an accomplishment. A few years ago, the American progressive columnist and substacker Matthew Iglesias wrote a piece where he tried to understand why the politics of immigration were so different in Canada versus the United States. Why was immigration such a divisive issue in the US, while in Canada it was not? And to deepen the mystery, why did immigration generate so much controversy and polarization in the US and not in Canada, given that Canada was the higher immigration country, and the United States was the lower immigration country? Iglesias, by the way, is someone who favors higher immigration for the United States. He thinks that US immigration is too low, and he wanted the US to figure out how to emulate Canada. So, I want you to take a look at this chart, which I was hoping would be really big. It's a comparison of Canadian and American immigration rates over the last quarter century. I want you to ignore, for the moment, what happened after 2015, the latter third of the chart. The higher line, by the way, is Canada. The lower line is the United States. Both of these lines are measuring all forms of immigration, both regular permanent immigration and net temporary immigration. Just to be clear, net temporary immigration means temporary residents like students and temporary foreign workers arriving, minus students and temporary foreign workers leaving. In the case of the United States, the line even includes an estimate of illegal immigration. So what do we see? Well, from the year 2000 until 2015, Canada's immigration rate is pretty consistently 2 to 3 times higher than the United States. And that means relative to the size of each country's population, Canada was accepting 2 to 3 times as many immigrants each year as the United States. And yet, over this same period of considerably higher Canadian immigration than American immigration, a lot of Americans were freaking out about immigration and immigrants, while Canadians mostly were not, even though the US had less immigration and immigrants than Canada. So what's going on here? From the start of this century until the early 2020s, the statement, "there is too much immigration," was agreed with by only around a third of Canadians versus 2/3 who disagreed. A Pew poll in 2018 found that 68% of Canadians said that immigrants make our country stronger, and that was the highest level in the developed world. Just 27% said immigrants are a burden, and that was the lowest level in the developed world. A 2019 Gallup survey found that Canada had the world's most welcoming and positive attitudes towards immigrants. In the US, the survey found support for immigration declined with age. In Canada, there was no difference by age groups. The most pro-immigration Americans were those in their teens and their 20s, and even they were not as pro-immigrant as Canadian senior citizens. So to review, from 2000 to 2015, Canada is a high immigration country compared to the United States, which is a relatively lower immigration country. Yet the higher immigration country was not being torn apart politically or socially by the issue of immigration. Meanwhile, the lower immigration country, that's the US, was seeing its voters and its politics increasingly inflamed over the issue of immigration. There was a perception among many voters that the US was being overrun by immigration, which it was not and is not, all of which culminated in Donald Trump's takeover of the Republican Party and his election victory in 2016, and his re-election in 2024. So what explains this? You would think something very different would have happened here, given, again, Canada's the high immigration country, the United States is the low immigration country. The answer that Matthew Iglesias offered was this: stricter border control, more immigration. Let me say that again: stricter border control, more immigration. That was the answer he proposed to the question of what the United States can learn from the success of Canadian immigration. It is a paradoxical lesson. It is counterintuitive. It may not make sense to you, at least at first blush. But I believe it is correct. I believe it is one of the things that made the Canadian immigration system successful, that underpinned public support for it, and I'll try to explain a bit more about why that is. In my last lecture, I talked about the points system and Canada's emphasis on economic immigrants as an important part of the Canadian immigration secret sauce. After the creation of the point system in the 1960s, Canada emphasized choosing immigrants based on their education and their skills, and put less emphasis on choosing immigrants simply because they were related to someone already living in the country. The US system, in contrast, was doing the opposite. Even if Canadians didn't know all the details of how their immigration system worked, and it's a pretty complicated system that has become more and more complicated, they had a sense that a substantial share of immigrants to Canada were chosen for what they could bring to Canada, and that they were chosen for how they could benefit Canada and Canadians. And that was different from the American perception and somewhat different from the American reality. For example, the US permanent immigration system has long been heavily tilted towards family reunification, meaning people get to become Americans mostly because they have close relatives who are already Americans. In 2013, nearly 1.2 million people became US permanent residents, and nearly 2/3 of them were family-sponsored arrivals, meaning they were entitled to come to the US because they had close relatives or immediate family of US citizens. In contrast, just 1 in 6 new permanent American residents were chosen based on what the United States calls employment-based preferences, meaning that they were skilled or unskilled workers, investors, or people with advanced educations. The Canadian system was very different. The proportions were almost a mirror image of the US. A small part of the Canadian immigration system was, and still is, family reunification, meaning people who got into Canada primarily because they are related to someone in Canada. And that usually represents around 20% of Canada's permanent residents, sometimes a little higher, sometimes a little lower. In contrast, about 60% of new permanent residents to Canada were, and still are, chosen through the economic immigration streams. They get to become Canadians because, and only because, Canada has chosen them. And the idea of the point system was that Canada would choose, were basically highly sought after draft picks. In addition to being a positive for the Canadian economy, this would make Canadians feel that immigration was a matter of choice and mutual benefit, not a burden or obligation. This is very different from how many voters in most other developed countries perceive immigration. So tonight I want to talk about that aspect of the Canadian system. The chapter in my book, as Sarah mentioned, on all of this is titled The Symbiotic Relationship Between Walls and Doors. It is possible to build a wall without a door. That is what some members of Donald Trump's MAGA movement would like, just a solid barrier to new arrivals with no openings. But it's not possible to have a door without something holding it up, like a wall. Canada has long had a relatively wide immigration door and a public supportive of that because Canada also had tall and assiduously maintained border walls. We have long had higher and more effective immigration walls than the US, and consequently and paradoxically, we have had higher immigration and higher acceptance of immigrants and immigration. The welcome mat and the walls are a package deal. I believe this is a key part of why the Canadian immigration system was successful and popular and how it can be again. And the original title from my book, the working title, was 5 Walls and a Door. 3 of Canada's 5 walls are the dumb luck of geography: Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Arctic Ocean. You can cross the Aegean from Asia to Europe in a dinghy, but unless you can get your hands on a big ship and a crew, you can't cross thousands of miles of difficult ocean. In 2024, there were 30 asylum applications at Canadian ports. That's it. The 4th wall is also geographic luck. It's the fact that Canada's land border, the longest on the planet, is with the United States. The world's leading economy has historically been a people magnet. Over the last 250 years, there have been many times when the U.S. sent large numbers of immigrants to Canada, from the Loyalists to the Underground Railroad to the Vietnam War. But until recently, very few people had sought to use the U.S. as a backdoor to Canada. The U.S. has a lot of recent experience with people simply walking across the border from Mexico into America, most recently between 2021 and 2024, when several million people did it, and with the result that so inflamed U.S. public opinion that Donald Trump won the 2024 election. But until Roxham Road, Canada had really no recent experience of this. So the U.S. was basically our 4th border wall. And the 5th Canadian border wall, the one we never talk about, is the bureaucratic barrier that Canadian governments erected to cover the gaps in the geographic wall. For example, for most citizens of most countries, coming to Canada, even as a tourist, involves the need to apply for a visa whose issuance is far from automatic. Despite Canada's open-door reputation, the country traditionally maintains some of the world's most restrictive visa rules. A 2017 World Economic Forum study of travel and tourism professionals rated Canada as just about the toughest country in the world to get a visa, 120th out of 136 countries. And that was not a bug of the Canadian system. It was not thought of as a failure, it was a critical feature. It was a quiet but effective way of preempting irregular immigration and preventing potential immigrants and refugee claimants from just showing up, which is what happens in many European countries and what happens at the southern US border. As such, Canada's 5th wall was also a quiet but effective means of maintaining popular support for immigration. Again, I come back to this paradox. The point of the 5th wall was not to ensure that no immigrants could come to Canada. Again, even before the Trudeau government, Canada was a relatively high immigration country, and Canada had a higher immigration than the US almost every year, year after year, for the past 125 years. The point of the 5th wall was to ensure that the people who came to Canada, whether economic immigrants or refugees or tourists, had been vetted and chosen by Canada before they got to Canada. Like the points system, this turned immigration into an act of mutual and reciprocal choice. Immigrants chose Canada, but Canada chose the immigrants who it would allow to choose Canada. And that sense of control allowed Canadians to be comfortable with immigration, to be generous about immigration, and to choose more immigration than our peer countries. I'm going to ask you to engage in a little thought experiment. Let's imagine that before you came here tonight, you had a $10 bill in your pocket. And sometime between home and here, the $10 left your pocket. Let's imagine that the money exited your pocket in one of two possible ways. The first way is that somebody took $10 out of your pocket. What would be your attitude, your state of mind to this? I imagine you'd be upset about it. Nobody wants to lose $10. But even more than that, there's a sense of injustice, of a loss of autonomy, of a loss of control that somebody just took $10 from you. Now let's imagine a second way $10 might have left your pocket. You gave it away. Somebody asked you for $10 and you gave it to them. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe it was someone on the street. Maybe it was early November, you gave $10 to the Poppy Fund. Maybe you gave $10 to the homeless shelter. Maybe you gave $10 to the food bank or some charity. In both of these scenarios, the voluntary and the involuntary, you are out $10. The actual amount of money that left your pocket is the same. But depending on how and why the $10 left your pocket, your mental state will be completely different. In the first scenario, where the $10 was taken without your consent, you feel a loss of power and autonomy. You might be angry and you might be upset about it. In the second case, where you voluntarily gave the money away, you feel great. You feel wonderful. And you might also believe that giving $10 to a good cause will make your community a better place, which means your act of altruism and generosity may also benefit you, and that the recipient and the giver will both win out of this deal. I suggest to you that when the Canadian immigration system was functioning at its highest level and was most popular and least controversial with voters, it was a little bit like that. Immigration was popular because it was chosen by Canada. Canadians chose to share the opportunity to become a Canadian citizen with a relatively large but limited number of people each year, and they did not only do it to benefit the recipients of the generosity, but in the belief that in the long run, it would benefit Canada and it would benefit them. That their $10, if I can stick with this analogy, would be repaid and would be more than repaid. And that is simply not how immigration was presented or imagined or experienced by many, and I would say even most voters in the United States and Europe. In the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom in 2016, the Leave side persuaded a majority of British voters that exiting the European Union was in their economic self-interest. Now, exiting the European Union was not, in fact, in Britain's economic self-interest. Put that aside for a moment. I want to point out the slogan the winning campaign was built around. Take back control. Take back control. It expresses and animates the sensibilities and frustrations of many voters, and not just in the United Kingdom. A big part of the reason why Canada for decades had relatively high immigration without experiencing a backlash is because a majority of Canadians did not feel that immigration was out of Canada's control. They believed that the immigration level was a choice rather than an imposition. Immigration itself was a choice rather than an imposition. It was pitched as something Canada wanted and had chosen, and something that was being carefully run by the government for the benefit of Canada. It was not presented or imagined as something Canadians just had to live with. It was sold to Canadians and appears to have been widely experienced, not as a loss of national sovereignty, but as an exercise of it. A country perpetually worried about losing control of its culture and its economy thought its immigration policy was very much under its control, and that it was choosing its own policy for very good reasons, including to benefit Canada. However, if you take away the fifth wall, this story can change. The point system ceases to function. Take away the fifth wall, and you put an end to the whole notion of Canadians and immigrants mutually choosing one another. Without the bureaucratic wall, the question of who can immigrate and how many is no longer in the hands of Canada and Canadians. The approach that worked for decades in Canada was pro-immigration and pro-immigrant, but with a lot of fine print. There was a door, but it was protected and supported by a series of load-bearing walls. The world saw Canada as a place with a progressive and welcoming immigration policy, and that was not mistaken. But the view from a distance glossed over some key details. The progressive system was also the product of a conservative culture that was famously persnickety in its insistence on rule following, in a country where lining up and politely waiting your turn is a national value and jumping a queue is a social taboo. The Canadian immigration system had a similar yin-yang. The country's approach to immigration was in many ways generous and softer-hearted than the United States. Less noticed were all the ways in which the Canadian system was harder-headed and I'd say even harder-assed. Canada's hard and soft approaches to immigration were not a contradiction. They were linked. The former enabled the latter. The walls held up the door. And a high degree of national choice about immigration is necessary because there are today so many people in the world who want to come to Canada. A Gallup survey from 2013 that polled thousands of people in dozens of countries concluded that at least 900 million people want to immigrate, and at least 74 million of them want to come to Canada. For reasons I won't get into here, those numbers are probably a significant underestimate. One possible national choice is to simply allow anyone who wants to immigrate to Canada to do so, to have open borders, meaning anyone can come for any reason. This is a perfectly philosophically consistent idea, and it would certainly make things a lot simpler. How many immigrants should a country welcome? Under open borders, the answer would be as many as want to come. What kinds of immigrants? Any and all. We would need no system for deciding or prioritizing. We would need no bureaucracy to screen aspiring immigrants. Immigration would be 100% up to them and 0% up to us. We would need no system for determining who is a refugee and who is not, since anyone would have the right to move to our country for any reason. Just as there are no laws preventing a resident of Halifax from moving to Calgary, the right to mobility within Canada being enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there would be a right to international mobility. But unless a country adopts such a policy of unlimited immigration, choices must be made. There is no escaping it. In 2015, the Trudeau government said it would accept 25,000 Syrian refugees, and by the end of 2016, Canada had welcomed around 40,000. This was a generous gesture, and it was widely supported by Canadians. But at the same time, there were about 5 million Syrians who were refugees at that point. Canada offered to accept less than 1% of them. It means that Canada's choice, generous as it was also to block about 99% of Syrian refugees. If any one of those 99% had bought a ticket and tried to reach Canada, the airlines would have followed Canada's rules and stopped them from getting on the plane. So our immigration debates are not about polar opposites, about pro-immigration and anti-immigration. They are mostly about degrees of differences between the extremes. How many immigrants, of what type, chosen how, and why. Unless you decide that the appropriate number of immigrants Canada is willing to receive is infinite, and that who and how many come is entirely up to them, you have no choice but to wrestle with difficult questions. If immigration has limits, what should they be? If there's a queue, who should go to the head of the line? How many immigrants should we welcome? How do we choose? And what costs and benefits do these choices bring? Much of my book is about trying to answer that, trying to wrestle with that, and trying to understand how Canada was answering those questions prior to 2015, and how Canada was achieving relatively good economic outcomes from immigration, while at the same time having immigration remain mostly popular and uncontroversial, and trying to understand what we can learn from all of that, from that successful past, and how we can hopefully apply it to the future and improve upon it in the future. I want to close tonight with a quick look at the how Canada got immigration wrong part of my book. So let's go back to looking at this table comparing Canadian and American immigration. If you look at the lower line, you see the bump in U.S. immigration during the Biden administration, which happened when several million people crossed the Mexico-U.S. border and made asylum claims. That was the biggest immigration surge in U.S. history, and it basically did in the Biden administration. By early 2024, a Pew poll found that 44% of Americans thought the situation at the border was a crisis, and another 32% called it a big problem. This is a major reason for the re-election of Donald Trump. That's the lower line, the bump that gets it only up to basically Canadian immigration levels when Canadian immigration was normal. Now look at what happened in Canada. Canada's immigration surge was about 3 times as big. Canada took in 3.1 million people in 3 years. Immigration had been very stable from the early 1990s until the mid-2010s. That really began to change after 2016, and then it radically changed after 2020. But it wasn't just the numbers. Under the Trudeau government, a series of things that made the Canadian immigration system work and made it sustainable and politically popular were ignored or undermined or outright eviscerated. Careful control of the border went out the window. Canada traditionally had relatively high but stable permanent immigration, but not much temporary immigration. That began to change under the Harper government, and it really got supercharged under the Trudeau government. It became very easy for businesses to claim that they were experiencing what they called labor shortages, and those labor shortages were never at the top end of the market, but at the bottom. It became very easy for a fast food restaurant or a barber shop or a retail store or a warehouse to receive permission to hire an allegedly temporary worker for a permanent minimum wage job. The system became a rubber stamp that always said yes. Similarly, the issuance of student visas was effectively outsourced to the provinces and to higher education institutions, and the numbers exploded. It turned the student visa program into an alternative temporary foreign worker program, and one that became much, much bigger than the temporary foreign worker program. The bulk of that run-up took place at lower quality institutions. The most prominent of them were Ontario colleges, which did deals with private operators to create strip mall campuses solely for foreign students. But this actually happened across the country, somewhat more in some places, somewhat less in others. It was basically a cash grab by some of the provinces and some institutions, and what was being sold for the price of often minimal tuition was the right to come to Canada, the right to work full-time at an entry-level job while in school, and the school programs were often extremely short, and the right to get an ongoing work permit after graduation in the hope that low-level Canadian work, along with what might have been a low-level educational credential, would get you permanent residency. By 2023, Canada had 1 million foreign students, which is as many foreign students as there are in the United States. And the number would have gone much higher had Ottawa not finally slammed the brakes on in 2024. But there's more. The Trudeau government also got rid of the visa requirements for certain travelers, notably travelers from Mexico, and as predicted, there was a considerable run-up in the number of people who got on a plane from Mexico as tourists and got off the plane in Canada as refugee claimants. There were also the opening of a number of other routes for this to happen, including the visa student program. And on top of it all, the permanent immigration system was tilted from its previous focus on highly skilled economic immigrants to more of an emphasis on lower skilled immigrants. The points system had run a big part of the Canadian immigration system like a highly selective university. That was eviscerated. And there was really very little study beforehand of the likely consequences of all of this, very little follow-up to study the outcomes, and essentially no public consultation or debate, pretty much no parliamentary oversight. It all happened very much in the dark. It was widely supported by all the stakeholders, business, higher education, most of the provinces, immigration activists, and the Century Initiative, but it ignored the national interest. And in 2023, by 2023, public opinion turned against this new immigration policy. Public support and public trust had been seriously undermined. And public trust is something that takes a very long time to build, but can be destroyed pretty quickly. One positive note in all of this is that while polls showed that Canadians were upset at the changes to the immigration system, they appeared to blame the government, not immigrants. And in fact, polls suggest that immigrants and non-immigrants were in many ways on the same page, and are in many ways on the same page with regard to immigration. For example, a 2024 poll from the multicultural broadcaster Omni TV found that the overwhelming majority of Indo-Canadians believed that the visa student system had to be reined in. That was even though the largest group of foreign students are from India. Earlier this year, a CBC poll asked if Canada was accepting too many immigrants and international students with no planning for adequate housing, infrastructure, or having sufficient job opportunities. 80% of Canadian immigrants agreed with that statement. I want to close with a final story. Many of you no doubt know the American talk show host Conan O'Brien. A recurring character on the show who I love is a guy named Jordan Schlansky. Jordan Schlansky was always said to be Conan's associate producer, but Conan could never figure out what he did. That was sort of their bit. When he was asked about his job, Schlansky would always reply that he had, quote, various duties, unquote, which were vital, yet which he could not describe. This would always lead Conan to doubt that Schlansky did anything at all. In one bit, where Conan was giving staff performance reviews, he went around asking employees whether they deserved to keep their jobs. Asked to explain how he was vital to the operation, Schlansky said, "If I do my job well, you'll never know about it." And Conan said, "Hang on a second. So when you're performing at your highest capacity, I don't notice you." And Schlansky said, "That's correct." Immigration was the Jordan Schlansky of Canadian public policy. All those years when it was performing at a high level, nobody paid it much mind. The fact that nobody paid it much mind was in fact proof that it was doing its job. It was like functioning plumbing, which when it is functioning, nobody thinks about. And when it stopped working, it was impossible not to notice that something had gone terribly wrong. When Canadian immigration was successful, it generated the least possible fuss and bother, unlike American immigration, which has for decades generated an abundance of fuss, bother, conflict, and polarization. My hope is that we can figure out how to get back to where we were and move forward from there. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll now ask Ninette to come up and join me, and we're going to talk for a bit, and then a little bit after that, we're going to take your questions. Yes, this works. Hey. First of all, thank you very, very, very much for being here. For those of you who don't know, my book is a very, very, very short look at the immigration system. My guest here on stage has written 2 encyclopedic looks at the immigration system in exceptional detail. So I'm really honored that you're here tonight. There are areas where we agree and there are areas where we disagree. And by the way, disagreeing is not bad. It's normal. We couldn't make policy if we didn't have people disagreeing about things. I want to start by talking about some things that I think we agree on. We were talking about this the other day, that we're both kind of driven crazy by the opacity of how the system is run, the lack of clarity of data, the lack of public consultation, the lack of ability to figure out exactly what's going on and what the consequences of the choices are. That's a really big question. Do you want to start by talking a bit about that?
Sure, and I think I'm going to start also, since you've started with that, just to mention, I don't think we got immigration ever got out of control. I think it was a conscious choice of the government to let in more permanent residents and more temporary workers. And when the public reacted to it, they cut back. So I think you and I would agree on that. I don't think it was a loss of control. And I think the reason why Canadians didn't respond so much to immigration policy, let's say in the early 2000s, is because most people didn't really know too much about it, including myself. And we didn't see the kind of effects, they weren't as visible as what was caused by the rapid increase of temporary foreign workers and permanent residents, primarily in the housing and the healthcare sectors, I would say. So that brings me to this issue of, I'm not sure that when the public doesn't squeak, it means it's going well. And we don't know how well immigration policy has been going for the last 25 years because, as Tony says, There's been no independent evaluations on any of these programs, and they should be baked into the programs themselves. And what happened in 2006 is the old way of initiating new programs, which would be initiated either through legislation or through regulation, debated in Parliament, public hearings, that's gone by the wayside. And in 2006, the government allowed itself to pass legislation that allows the minister to change immigration programs daily if he or she wants, in both in the economic stream and the family stream, which make up the majority of immigrants to Canada. And that happens all the time. There are, I don't know, we know that in one program, the provincial programs, I think there's 78 different streams. They keep adding new programs, taking ones away without ever providing the evidentiary basis and analysis for which the public can look as to why these programs are necessary, or bake in impact assessments to adjust and to see how they do over time. And Tony, that's the weakness, I think, in our immigration policy.
And to go back a little bit, again, because you have the encyclopedic knowledge of all of this, there is a period. So Canada has a long history in the early 20th century of doing immigration policy in total opacity, no oversight, no rule of law. And then we have our recent history of also total opacity and complete executive discretion. But there is a period where we did a better job of this. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
It was in between 1976 and I'd say the 1990s. The Immigration Act itself had a lot more detail. And before any change in immigration policy, by the way, I mean, it feels very controversial right now, but it has always been a hot button issue. And I could tell you many periods in history where it was vitriolic, way more than it is today. So we should be heartened by that, I think. But when the government would make a major change in policy between 1976, for example, and 2001, it would always be predicated on serious papers, public review, commentary, hearings. And after 2001, that has really gone by the wayside. And that doesn't happen anymore. And I think it's a great shame.
When was the last time that Canada had kind of a extensive and deep public consultation on immigration policy and then followed up by actual tracking of the data and the consequences of the policy?
Well, I think it was probably in the 1980s, 1990s. And when we introduced the point system, we also at one point system is where you evaluate applicants based on their education skills and that sort of thing. Later on, they introduced what's called occupational preferences. And when in the 1990s, they studied this as to whether or not that was a good way to go about in selecting immigrants for the longer term, and they found actually occupational preferences, while it could meet a short-term need, was a very poor indicator of how immigrants would fare over time. So the 2001 Immigration Act did away with that and went back to the point system, which you were talking about, which you advocate we should revert to. But we have not, since the 1990s, had any kind of in-depth discussion or review. And so my caution is, just because the government has pulled back and said we'll let in less permanent residents and we're going to cut the number of international students and cut the number of temporary workers, we should not be mollified by that.
Yeah, and this is an area that I agree with you on, because it's so hard to figure out exactly what's going on. The government will make sort of statements with top-line numbers. We kind of don't know how that really filters through over the years, and we don't necessarily know the consequences, and the policy may change before we get to the knowledge of the consequences. That's my worry.
No, it's true. And you used to be able to get data on immigration very easily, and comparative data, and they used to publish regularly historical reviews where you could compare periods of time. They've discontinued that. Tony and I had a very funny exchange just yesterday where we were trying to determine what this year, what were the number of refugee claims made both inland and at the border. Tony had a figure. I thought, that's kind of high. I went and checked. I found different figures. I sent him the sites. He responds back to me. These are all government sites. He responds back to me, yeah, but I found this one, and not different number as well. So it's very disconcerting, especially for people who would like to study the impact of immigration policies over time. Getting that data is very, very difficult.
Yeah, and when we were going back and forth on this, we also noticed, for example, there's one site that for a couple of years, they sort of had like monthly updates on refugee claims, but that site's now archived. It will not be updated anymore. You can go somewhere within the government website, you can allegedly find Excel spreadsheets that will contain this data, though it may be presented differently. And that's the other issue that we've also talked about, is to be able to study something, you got to be able to do longitudinal comparisons of, okay, well, what happened this year and the year before and the year before? That's also difficult to do.
It's almost impossible. And there's no requirement that the new programs provide for that. And I think if I were saying, should there be one advocacy message, it would be that we should demand as the public that they provide and they make as part of their immigration programs an evaluation function, independent evaluation over a long period of time, because that's the only way that you see the impact. And we shouldn't be starting new programs until we've assessed the ones that are already ongoing.
Yeah, it's like so basic, it's hard to believe we're not doing that. It's constantly shocking. I mean, it is one of the things that does shock me. We'll get off this topic in a second, but it does amaze me how hard it is to find out exactly what is going on in our immigration system. I came to this issue relatively fresh a couple of years ago, and it remains mysterious to me how we can't
Me
figure
too.
what's going on. Yeah. Okay, let's talk a little bit about refugees, because that was the data point that you and I were going back and forth on yesterday, of trying to figure out, okay, well, exactly how many refugee claimants do we have in Canada, and how many have come in each month and each year. And by the way, that should be a really straightforward number, and yet the government actually has its own competing data on this. So right now, according to the data I looked at, in 2015, there were 10,000 people in Canada who had applied for refugee status and were awaiting a decision. The figure as of last month is now, I believe, 299,000. How do you think Ottawa should respond to this?
Well, let's unpack that a little bit. I mean, I think in 2015 it was probably more than 10,000, because there's been a backlog in the refugee determination process for some time. But several things happened that increased our numbers on refugee claims. One was the sudden decision by the government to reduce the number of temporary visa holders, whether they be international students or workers, who then, anticipating staying in Canada for 3 years, find out that they can only stay for 1 and then apply for refugee status. Okay, so that's one category. The other is the Mexicans. An important one was with the onset of the Trump administration and their real crackdown on refugee policies, we did have a surge at Roxham Road, which got everybody excited, understandably so, because people, legitimate refugees in the United States, were very fearful that what came to pass would, and they would no longer have an access to a fair process. So there are a number of different tensions that were playing on Canada, which created a situation where we now do have a large backlog of cases. My view has always been that is manageable if we put the resources in to do very fair, efficient decision-making closer to the place of arrival where refugees arrive. And we right now have so many different actors who are screening for, I won't get into all the technicalities, but are they eligible to claim? Are they inadmissible to Canada? We have so many different steps in the process that each step by each different actor adds delay. So I think the refugee program is one that's long overdue for an overhaul, and there's great recommendations on the table, most recently from 2018, but getting this government or even the previous government to listen is extremely difficult now that they have insulated themselves to make policy without any kind of consultation or public transparency.
Yeah, I tend to think, and again, you've looked at the system much more in detail than I have, but I tend to think you have to speed up the system. You have to have more adjudicators. You have to have a way to make these decisions faster and not leave people in limbo for years. Are you at all concerned, though, that if you speed up the system, it's an incentive for more people to try to make refugee claims?
Not so much, Tony. I don't have the same concerns that you do in terms of, I worked at the height of the Syria crisis in Lebanon. I can assure you, most Syrian refugees weren't dying to get to Canada. There are obviously Syrian refugees who want to come to Canada. There are refugees all over the world that if they could, they would. It's very hard to get here. It's very expensive. You've got to go through multiple different gateways. Many people who get here are those with the skills and the resources to be able to find a way here. So I'm not that concerned. I am somewhat troubled by what's happening in the United States. And I think our way of dealing with that, which is essentially to say, if you're a refugee who's come from the United States, you may not claim in Canada, is going to be highly problematic given the lack of protections that refugees are facing in the United States. But what Canada is doing right now is just to tighten up that regulation rather than deal with the very serious concern that we could get elevated numbers of genuine refugees, and how are we going to process those in a timely, fair, and efficient manner?
Yeah, and I sort of end my book talking about this possibility that the United States, instead of being something we don't really think about in immigration policy, becomes an engine of exporting refugee claimants to Canada, precisely because the Trump administration is being so atrocious that people have no other choice. How do you think the Canadian courts and the Canadian Supreme Court may respond to that? Because again, just as you've alluded to, we have this safe third country agreement with the United States, which says, the United States is a safe country. If you're a refugee claimant, you can just be returned forthwith to the United States, make your refugee claim, it's safe there. It's pretty clear that the U.S. immigration system at this point is not functioning in a manner to give people fair refugee hearings. Maybe some of them are, but clearly not all of them are. It's pretty random. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting because the case was already litigated at a time when it wasn't as bad as it is right now. And the court said, you've got to consider whether or not, in an individual case, whether the United States is safe for you, in particular, looking at gender-based persecution, which in the United States is not considered a ground for granting refugee status, and in Canada it is. So it's, again, under consideration in the courts. The situation in the States is so much worse now than it was then that I find it just incredible that the government has put forward this new strong borders bill, which tightens the control in terms of making it even more difficult for people who've not only come through the States but elsewhere to claim refugee status, to think that that would survive a charter challenge. Yeah. I don't think it would. And then, therefore, I think we've just done something very silly. We might put a stopgap in place, but it's just going to create more delays and more complication later. Why don't we get it right now?
Yeah. What do you think they should do? Because I see the dilemma that they're in.
I do too.
Ideally, they're, again, in my ideal sort of hypothetical fantasy world, Canada takes in lots of refugees, but nobody just shows up. We could end up in a very, very, very different situation because
we could end up like many other states and many other countries in the world.
Yes.
And we don't take that many refugees. Come on. And now in the levels plan, we're even thinking of taking less than we did.
Yep.
So we walk around in Canada, I'm sorry, but this myth that we're so generous, we're really not that generous in terms of international protection. And let me add that we've cut down our international aid budget too to be embarrassingly low, especially vis-a-vis other countries in the industrialized world, that I want to get that on the table. We're not as good as we think we are.
And I think that's a fair point. That said,
I think we need to have much more efficient decision making and closer at the point of arrival than we do right now.
Yeah. My concern would be, and again, this is not about refugee law, it's about consequences in politics, would be that if the Trump administration loses its mind, as it is beginning to do, and hundreds of thousands of people feel they should just come across the Canadian border, that is going to have some very big impacts on Canadian politics. But I don't know what to do about that. I am
Well,
genuine.
no, and I'm not sure that that's going to happen either.
I am hopeful
So,
that's
I mean,
not going to
that's
happen.
where
I'm not sure it's going to happen
That's
either.
where being fearful can kind of lead to reactions. There are times when countries close borders, and let me give you which even a person who's committed to refugee protection like myself, I do understand. In Lebanon, within 2 years, Lebanese had accepted 1 million refugees, and they were a population of only 4 million in a state that could fit really nicely inside the state of Connecticut. So extremely small country. And they closed their borders. And at the time I was the head of our operations there, I wasn't critical of them because sometimes you do have to close the border. There was a time in the States before Trump, where they closed the border because it was getting too much. Sometimes countries have to do that. We're far from that point.
No, and I'd agree with you on that. I'm speculating about the future, but that is
Right.
not the present. You're absolutely correct about that. Let's talk a little bit more about, I'll ask you a few questions about integration of immigrants. And by integration, I don't mean cultural assimilation or anything like that. I just mean, are we doing a good enough job with services of allowing immigrants to be successful? Education, language skills, whatever. Are we providing enough support, or are we falling down in those areas?
I think, and I hope there are people in the settlement services here tonight, but I think most people who are in the field will tell you know that it's getting worse. And I think there's a couple of problems that we have. One is immigrants who come with skills and qualifications often find it hard to get jobs that are commensurate with their skills and their certificates. The exception are immigrants from the United States or Northern Europe, which is very telling, is it not? Secondly, I think language programs tend to be standardized across the country, so there's a sense that those who do benefit from language instruction, that is helpful to them. But settlement services are provided by a myriad of actors, some federally funded, provincial funded, municipal, different NGOs, on very tight budgets, usually only annually. And once again, getting back to data and evidence, there are very few assessments that are done to say, have these services been able to achieve what was intended? And if they're only funded on an annual basis, it's difficult to plan for longer term. So by and large, I think we don't get a very high passing grade on integration services. Having said that, we have this commitment that people believe still in Canada towards multiculturalism, which I do think is very helpful. But I'd add one more thing, that our immigration rates of recently arrived immigrants are at historic highs. So why is that? And I think lack of integration possibilities is possibly one answer to that.
And then another area that I touched on is the sort of fairly radical changes that took place in the education system, and then the attempt to sort of swing back very hard in the other direction. Do you have any thoughts on what happened in the education system and what might be a better student visa program?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I think it did get out of hand, and we know there were all sorts of educational institutions that were scams, and people were coming in. Having said that, there are credible colleges and universities who've seen their provincial funding cut. And for them, international students are an important lifeline to quality education, which we as Canadians should want. Secondly, it's a service that we provide the rest of the world, I think, as well, to allow people to come in to get educated and to return home better qualified, hopefully, than they would have a chance to at home. So the overcorrection, I'm not convinced that that's being intelligently handled.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. You know, again, if you take a look at my book, sort of my thoughts on this are that it's not the issue was not so much the number of foreign students, it was sort of the institutions, the quality, the reasons that they were coming, that if you have a large number of foreign students coming and they're going to good programs, they'd be great to select as future immigrants, that's a good thing. Or if they're going to good programs and they're going to take that knowledge back to their home countries, that's also a good thing. But there are financial benefits, immigration benefits. What it seems to me happened with a chunk of the visa student program is that essentially it became a very low-end kind of cash grab where, in Ontario in particular, for example, a whole series of colleges just partnered with private entrepreneurs and said, let's set up a visa student-only campus, which is really just in a strip mall, and let's offer some very low-end programs. They were usually called international business or something like that, and we're really just selling the right to come to Canada. We're not really doing education. That was my concern.
No, agreed.
I think we should wrap it up and bring Sarah back up to ask let the audience ask some questions. So thank you very much, and I think, Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Oh, great, thank you so much. This has been incredibly informative for me, I have to say, but also just fascinating how it slips from a question about policy into really process and information and some of the sort of bumps and challenges that are very much again, policy can only take us so far if we don't have the other pieces in place and it properly functioning. So my job up here is to take some questions, and if I can ask you to do two things. If you have a question, to actually, if you're able to get up and go to the microphone, and then also just before you ask your question, just to say your name, and if you have any affiliation that matters or not, that would be great.
My name is Maggie Abdelmasih, and I'm a retired professor at St. Mary's. And while you spoke a lot about the refugees, one of the things that you did not touch on is the wider policy of the country of no problem bombing other places and then we close the door on the refugees. And that is what happens with Gaza, is that a lot of people have been bombed with pieces of the equipment from Canada, and Canada has yet, after 2 years of a genocide, to bring one single refugee from Gaza. And they say we are open, but one of the excuses becomes, well, if you can fly, you'll be able to enter into Canada. In a sense, the refugees on the ground, or the refugee committee on the ground, or the government doing the refugee, is not talking to the part of the government that is actually causing the wars in other places that are bringing the refugees to us. And when you say which refugees should come, I would say any war Canada has participated in, you take their refugees. That smiles like a moral responsibility. I have other points to make, but this is actually my most major one.
Thanks so much. I'm happy just when somebody asks a question, just to turn it over to the two of you to decide who wants to answer. That may be something that Ninette wants to answer, but go.
I don't have anything to say on that, in the sense that I'm certainly not an expert on Canada's refugee policy with regard to Gaza. So if you have anything you want to add to that, please.
Well, I think it's a fair point, actually. Your equation of if we participate in a war, I find that interesting. On the visa, I find it troubling that we were so. I was all in favor for the massive outpouring of support and the facilitation of Ukrainians to Canada, of which we took tens of thousands of people in a very short period of time. And we did not do all the security screenings that the government says are necessary for Gaza. And I think the Gazan program was much smaller. If I could be wrong, but I think it was around 5,000, and in the last 2 years, or 4,000, we've left in 1,200, I think was the last statistic I read.
Any of the refugees from Gaza, what we allowed in are those Palestinians that had asked to come in early.
Okay, there we go. So that's a good distinction. But it's a kind of double standard that does happen with these special programs that deserves more scrutiny, I think, and I think your point is well made.
Thank you.
Great. First of all, thank you so much for first your presentation, and also this very, I think, pleasant conversation. Even though you might have some disagreements, it was a very productive one. My name is Kieran Banerjee. I teach at Dalhousie University. I have two questions. One is sort of turning toward this shorthand you guys used of the point system for economically driven and evaluative admissions. And one thing I was struck by, or I've thought about quite a bit, is the fact that the point system isn't really how most admissions take place now. In fact, they're done through a much more elaborate, complex system. And you know, Ninette, when you mentioned this earlier example of the bygone era when Canadians were actually asked what we thought about immigration policy, you pointed to this example, which I wasn't aware of occupational preference, as something which they tried, and they're like, well, this doesn't actually work, let's go back to the point system. So what I've been struck by is how few Canadians know that we don't use the point system for immigration admissions. We use a much more complex, labor-driven, and opaque system, which changes from week to week. And I'm sort of interested in your guys' thoughts about how that fits into your story about the shift in immigration policy. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, but I did have some other questions about refugees and such, but I'd just be interested in that question.
Well, thank you for that. And so this is an area that I touch on a little bit in the book, and it is part of the incredible opacity and constant changing nature of the system and changes that took place over the last few years where, I mean, again, the point system, which is kind of a human capital measure, was never the whole immigration system and should never be the whole immigration system. But within the economic stream, it became a fairly big part. And it's now been sort of downgraded because the provinces run a chunk of the economic immigration system and they can use their own measures. We were talking about this earlier in comparing the experiences of our two separate Uber drivers and how they had come to Canada through the provincial nomination program, which isn't the point system. And then there's also what they call category-based selection, which is whether the federal government or a provincial government sort of just says, well, we've decided we need workers in X field because X field lobbied us. And so it's not a human capital measure. It's hey, there's a shortage of warehouse workers this week, so immigration that way. So I'm troubled by that because it doesn't seem like a very good way to run the system, and it's not how it was supposed to be run, and I don't think it's beneficial.
And just to add a postscript to that, the one program that used to dominate the economic stream was the Federal Skilled Workers Program. It used to be 77% of the economic stream, and it was based on, almost entirely on points for human capital. It's now comprises, I think, 23% of the economic stream. So the other two programs are based on previous Canadian experience and, as Tony said, the provincial selection process, which still has a points component to it, but much more is given to job offers and employer preference. What's very interesting, I find, is that the studies that have been done, and there's been very few, show that over time, previous Canadian experience, people do get a job more quickly, but actually economic indicators of success are much higher for the Foreign Service Worker Program, which based entirely on points, than the occupational category dominant ones.
So I just meant,
Yep, go ahead.
the express entry system, though, would make it very hard to collect the sort of data you're interested in because the metrics are constantly changing. Like you don't even
You're right. So how do you, that's what Tony was saying. It's so hard to have a baseline. You don't have a baseline because the baseline's constantly shifting. Agreed.
We can't figure out what's going on, which may be deliberate.
Yeah, please, next.
Hello, I'm Alex. I'm an international student. I'm waiting for my postgraduate work permit right now. Thank you so much. It's really a great opportunity to let me, as an international student, know more about the Canadian immigrant progress. And my question is, we've seen the Trump administration dramatically increase the ICE arrests and enforcement across the country. From your perspective, what is the real strategy behind this aggressive immigration crackdown? And is it guaranteed that we will see this kind of action continue for the next 4 years? And another is about as border neighborhood, how is this huge shift in United States enforcement impact Canadian immigration policy? And will this boost more people to choose Canada rather than the US as an immigration destination? Thank you.
Yeah, these are really good questions. I mean, the first one is about US immigration policy. I'll say my impression of what the Trump administration is up to is it is trying to, well, first of all, it's trying to impress its base with how cruel it's being. And second of all, it's trying to terrify people into self-deporting. That is the term they will use. And I think that's actually part of what the US government at the moment is trying to do, because I think they understand they cannot round up millions of people. It's impossible. But if you immiserate people, maybe some of them will just get back on a plane. As for the, I think we talked a little bit earlier about what the possible consequences for Canada are. I think there is actually an opportunity for Canada in the sense that I think there's a foreign student opportunity. Sarah can probably speak to this. There's a graduate student opportunity, an academic opportunity to get really excellent people to come to Canada. So there may be some upsides for Canada in all of this.
But now we've put limits on foreign students, and universities don't necessarily have, well, Sarah, you should talk to this, the money to hire new faculty at a level of salary that the American employed academics are used to. But you probably know more about that, Sarah, than we do.
I'll just say a few things. I mean, the first is, the limitation on the number of students that we're allowed to bring in internationally has, in fact, had a dramatic effect. Anybody here, I mean, somebody from St. Mary's, others from Dalhousie know that effect has been quite dramatic. And I do feel like, as my institution, St. Mary's, probably quite responsible in terms of how we grew that international student population, and now suffering from the crackdown that perhaps other irresponsible educational institutions, are really probably more responsible for the crisis that was created. I will say, just as a little bit of a sort of an aside, and is within, so I am Dean of the Law School, as Professor Welsh mentioned, but there is a massive growth in trying to train foreign-trained lawyers. These are, some of these are Canadians who have gone abroad and come back, but many of them are, of course, immigrants to the country who are highly skilled. They're already lawyers. They're already trained. And there's a scramble to try to create programs to support them. There's a pretty tight funnel in terms of allowing them to practice and become licensed. There's many different hoops that they have to jump through in order to get there. And some of that seems appropriate for becoming a lawyer and getting licensed within any one of our provinces. But right now it feels a little bit, I'm right in the midst of this. I'm trying to create our own program in order to, and I'm working with Immigration Services Nova Scotia to try to sort of partner on creating some programs. And it's quite the hurdle to try to not only create the programs, but really support these students through the various hoops, various challenges, and some of them, sort of that's a wise thing for there to be that funnel. But in others, they've been practicing law for 10 years in Delhi, and sort of how we sort of find a way to be a little more flexible in terms of letting them in is something that we've been talking about a lot. So there is, going back to just the general sort of challenge. I mean, I think the challenge with the international students is huge. Going back to the one other thing that you mentioned, Ninette, about bringing some of the academics from the U.S. up here, and how we are sort of able to try to accommodate a pretty interested, sort of group of individuals from the U.S. to try to immigrate north. I will just tell you, because I've been part of these conversations, there are a lot of academics who will cut their salary significantly at this point in order and to come north if you just give them a job. I'm sure McGill's had a lot more of this than we get out here, but it's such an incredibly fractious and volatile situation in the U.S. Last thing, I know I'm going on too long here, sorry, but is simply that, I think we will see, and there needs to be more direct policy about that movement from the South, whether it's genuine refugees, as you said, or whether it's just this influx of highly skilled people who are so desperate to get out at this point.
And I just want to add, I have a section in the book where I talk about this, about what happened on visa student numbers in particular. And a lot of this is something that the provinces are going to have to decide for themselves, because the feds get to set the numbers, but the provinces get to decide how those visas get allocated. And so, in the book, I talk about a contrast between Waterloo and Conestoga College. Yeah. Waterloo, very high quality university. Its number of foreign students was very low and remained low all the way through this run-up. Conestoga College went from very few foreign students to, by 2023, it had received that year 32,000 student visas. So if Ontario and the other provinces were smart, they'd really slim down Conestoga, and they'd actually want more foreign students at Waterloo. And you'd want more foreign students at Dal, but that would involve governments making some smart choices, and we kind of used the blunt instrument of the Fed saying, we're just giving you fewer student visas, and the provinces don't seem to have, at least the provinces that I've looked at, Ontario in particular, don't seem to have responded very intelligently to the reduction in the numbers, and they don't seem to have allocated it well enough.
Right, and those choices might be smart, but they're, I think, exceptionally difficult as well to be made deciding between different institutions. But yes, go ahead.
Thanks. Ross Cantwell, live here in Halifax, worked for a couple of decades as a real estate consultant and now as a real estate developer. Country's built on immigration. Immigration's super important. We got to keep it going. Halifax has seen a boom. If you haven't been here in a while, and you drove in across the bridge, and
I noticed it.
All the buildings going up. This place has just exploded in the last 6 or 7 years, which in many ways is a good thing. Looking forward, though, it's all about forecasting demand for real estate, and so where does that come from? Well, population's part of it, but it's household formation. It's also the growth of the economy. Looking at the numbers, so the feds are saying, okay, the barn door was left open, and we had 1 million people a year for 3 years, and now we're playing catch up. So they're trying to suppress. I think they have to suppress things for a couple of years, so we can build enough housing, so we can get more, the doctor ratios, all these other things. My question is, going forward, the last number I heard was, I don't know if it was 380,000, 350,000 permanent residents, but they always talk about permanent residents, and yet we've had lots of international students, which again can be fine if they're, STEM researchers at Waterloo or Dal or whatever is great. But I'm kind of curious what's going on right now with, I hear that, the permanent residents, many of them already live here because they're international students or temporary foreign workers, and they're going to be granted permanent residence. So they've already housed, hopefully they have a doctor. And so looking forward, trying to forecast demand, where do we go? How transparent, and I hear a lot that it's not, but how are we going to figure that out going forward? Because you talk to Canada Mortgage and Housing and some of these other groups, and they're trying to project demand, and yet, the data is really a bit fuzzy.
Yeah, so the governments, for the first time, I guess, last year or the year before, finally said, oh, we'll have an immigration plan that includes temporary residents, because temporary residents live here. And the plan going forward seems to be, first of all, a very large chunk of permanent residents will already be here, they're temporary residents. Second of all, the temporary resident population will fall, meaning there'll be new temporary residents coming in, but there'll be even more leaving or transitioning to permanent residency, meaning that Canada should have, again, under their plans, pretty much no population growth for a couple of years, and the temporary population will shrink, meaning we'll actually have negative growth in the temporary population. That's the plan. We don't have a perfect sense of how well that's being executed. Because, for example, the government wanted to reduce the number of temporary residents from just over 3 million to about 2 million over the course of about 2.5 years. It's been stuck at 3 million for the last year and a half, at least based on the guesstimates of Statistics Canada, which we don't know exactly how accurate they are. So there's a lot we don't know, and that's frustrating because, again, immigration could be a little higher or a little bit lower. You could have a considerable run-up in immigration, but you better tell people that's happening so that real estate developers, governments, public health systems, whatever they are, will say, okay, this is what the future is going to look like. Let's plan for this.
Yes, please.
Hi there. My name's Carolyn Whiteway. I'm with an organization called the Atlantic Region Association of Immigrant Serving Agencies. So thank you for mentioning the importance of settlement services. My question, well, more a comment. I think it's interesting that there have been some gains over recent years as far as the federal government supporting longer-term contribution agreements with settlement providers, perhaps not so much on the provincial side. And I think your characterization of the sector is accurate. You know, it's a lot of hard people working very hard to settle newcomers. Recently, though, I think with the changes that we've seen in the budget and the different levels plan, it is going to have an impact. There is some evidence that settlement services, especially early on after arrival, are very beneficial, but not everybody knows about them. So that's one thing. But in the budget, where we saw the levels plan embedded in the budget for perhaps the first time, we also saw that there was a reference to potential limited services for economic immigrants. And I think this might be something that is coming, that perhaps there are limited services available, not just for economic immigrants, but others. And so my question, I'm just curious to know what do you consider the implications of that? You mentioned immigration as being perhaps one impact, but what are some other things that we might be thinking about if we're not able to settle and integrate newcomers well into Canadian society?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a real problem. And even right now, many of the settlement services, they are directed towards the principal applicant, but the family members don't necessarily get to benefit them, which is really too bad, because if you're trying to, some people really need to have training in the finances, how to handle financing here in Canada, which could be very different from at home, or how to navigate the school system or childcare, all sorts of things that give people comfort and a sense of belonging and help in their long-term integration. So by reducing funding for integration services, I think we do a real disservice in the longer term. But I'm kind of speaking out of my ear, because once again, we haven't really looked into this in very much detail. We know, for example, from studies in the United States and in Europe, that fast acquisition of citizenship, for example, is a good indication of how people are doing both socially and economically over the longer term. In Canada, our acquisition of naturalization, those rates have fallen. And does that reflect poor integration outcomes or not? So we need kind of more understanding in that area. What I'd really love, and I've bent Tony's ear just so much on all of this, I'd like a root and branch review of all the major aspects of immigration policy. So I would like to get people like yourself around a table, those who are most implicated in integration services, and say, how do we fix our system for the longer term? Because I think we have more to learn from you than you would have to learn from us.
Yeah, and I'll just offer a 20-second answer to that. First of all, I second what you just closed with. Absolutely true. As well, you know, governments have a habit of being penny wise and pound foolish. They have a habit of, they can find ways to bury $1 billion behind the door and spend it on nothing, and yet your organization, which probably runs on a shoestring, could benefit enormously from a very small amount of money and do a lot of good with a very small amount of money. And I am not an expert on immigrant services, but I'm fairly confident that providing really good services for really long periods of time to immigrants is something that is going to benefit them and Canada, and I would suggest we ought to spend more money on it.
So we'll take one more question.
Hi, my name's Karen Vogel. I'm new to Nova Scotia. I come from the west, from Calgary, where I've well, I taught for a number of years. I'm retired now, but my career made a shift into the immigrant population about 20 years ago when I started to teach English to highly skilled, professionally trained immigrants to Calgary. So these were engineers, lawyers, doctors who were looking to increase their language proficiency skills so that they could get into extended programs. It was very difficult for them to move ahead, not just with the language skills, but the opportunities to get work experience, so limited. It was a terrible cycle that they just couldn't seem to progress through. So I'm going to circle back to that in just a sec. Then I moved to high school level teaching in a highly specialized program for refugees. And these were students who had very limited schooling, formal schooling backgrounds, and came with a lot of needs, and worked through the Syrian wave. We were part of that. And I guess my questions now are, maybe touched base with the previous speaker or questioner there. The programs that support the refugee populations have just really seemed to have diminished, because I stay in touch with so many of my families, and when they say that there is a 2 to 3 year wait now for student or for family members to access English classes, it's just shocking. You know, it used to be that families could get services within a couple of months. Now they're being asked to wait for 2 or 3 years to get on lists and to, you know, so I don't know what's happening there. So I know you've touched on it. The encouraging thing I saw recently, though, was we were just in Calgary and attended the U of C Convocation, University of Calgary, and they had a huge roster of foreign-trained lawyers that have now graduated from the University of Calgary. And I don't know if you've, you probably have been in touch with them, but it was just so nice to see that happen and know that the first population of students that I had worked with so long ago, all those professionals, you know, it seems that there is something in place for at least the lawyer cohort, but I know there's many others that are not being addressed. Thanks.
I don't know if you want to address the
I mean,
language.
I can't speak to how much resources are going into English language training, but clearly a 2 or 3 time waiting period is like Tony saying, penny wise, pound foolish, really. But how many of us anecdotally have gotten out, and I say this, you know, gotten out of an Uber or a taxi, and the person who's driving it is somebody who could be our family physician or who could be, you know, an engineer in a major company and just hasn't been able to cut through. One, because the recognition of their qualifications is so difficult. But two, let's face it, there still remains discrimination by employers. They want to hire people whose qualifications probably they feel are more like the ones they themselves received. I don't want to say it's racism because I don't think it's overt racism, but I think there are preferences. But when you go deeper, and this, I want to say something positive. They'll talk about their children and what their children are doing, and it's always, they couldn't make it in their level, which they should have been able to, and it's a tragedy they couldn't. But their kids are doing it. And I take some real encouragement from that, and to say that I think we've painted here a fairly bleak picture, which I stand by in terms of government accountability. But by and large, we haven't done a terrible job. We've made mistakes along the way, but there is hope, but we need to keep, I think, the pressure on.
Yeah, and just to close on that positive note, I mean, we're in an immigration museum. I'd encourage all of you to come back when it's open and also to have them do some research on your ancestors. I did that the last time I was here, found my family's, you know, landing papers from 1939, 1938. I wish I had come back today to find the other side of the family, which came in 1894. So, you know, look, my book I think my book is a pro-immigration book. But it's a pro-immigration with limits, and be smart about it, and let's try to make the most of it and maximize it. I'm the son of someone who was not born in Canada, and I think Canada's a wonderful country, and we're all exceptionally lucky to be here. I'll close on that happy note. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I did know there's one other person with a question. Can I just ask you to ask it during the reception, if that's okay? Because I think.
Come talk to us.
Yeah, I think we'd like to wrap up. But just before I exit and let Jennifer come back up, I do just want to say that the concrete nature of this conversation is in some ways so refreshing. I mean, it's challenging in that it's sort of bleak, as you mentioned, but at the same time, it feels that just identifying some of these concrete problems is the first step in figuring out how we move forward. And we can all advocate now for deep studies, for sure, because that seems to be the biggest problem is nobody's studying it and there's no information accessible. So those are my marching orders now. Okay, Jennifer.
Thanks so much. So it only remains for me to give a few thanks. And I want to begin by thanking all of you. It is, particularly since COVID, always challenging to have live events, to come to a new city. As I said at the beginning, the Max Bell School, this is the first event that we've done on the East Coast. And I'm so glad that you came out this evening. I have the very great privilege and honor of leading a public policy school in Canada. And one of our missions, alongside trying to teach the next generation, is to actually have conversations that matter across the country. And I really want to say I feel we had that tonight with the discussion on stage, but also your engagement. So thank you so much for coming. But secondly, I want to thank Sarah Harding, an old friend of mine and colleague, for agreeing to be our host, given her long affiliation with Dalhousie. I was so pleased that she was able to come, got engaged with the topic, and was eager to be here. And then I want to thank Ninette, who I met for the first time tonight, who, as Tony said, has given us, in her work over many, many years, a huge treasure trove of data, analysis, hard-headed thinking about Canada's immigration system, and we saw only a very small glimpse of that tonight on stage. And then lastly, Tony Keller, for saying yes to being this year's lecturer on economic policy, writing this book for the Canadian public, for all of us. We have one more lecture left in Toronto, but I'm so glad to have been able to be on the road with Tony in Calgary and then here in Halifax tonight. I'd like to invite you all to stay, to have a glass, to stay for the reception, to continue the conversation. Tony will also sign books if you would like to do that. And so I'd like to close the evening also by thanking my colleagues from the Max Bell School who are here, Vinny and Adriana, who helped to put the event together, and everyone at Pier 21. It's been wonderful partnering with you. As Tony said, this in and of itself is an inspirational place, which many stories to tell about immigration to Canada. So thanks to you all, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.